Okay, sorry, we missed the first couple sections. Those of you who are watching, where we talked about type description, async foundations, and const eval. But on we go. Nevertype. Nothing's happened here. However, I asked Mark if he would look into it a little bit, because there might be some chance that we want to tie something to the addition. And that is somewhat time sensitive. And Mark, I think, is still game to do that. Is that true, Mark?
Yeah, so I expect to do that probably this weekend, and then potentially have something by triage next week or something like that.
My take is that it seems like Nevertype is becoming increasingly, I don't know, it's always been useful, but I think it was the try trait that pushed me over the edge to like really wanting it to be done now, because it was such a nice, elegant use of it in the residuals. So I'm still hoping we'll get this done. I still think I prefer my proposal of fallback that depends on context. What I don't know is, I don't remember what the regressions were like, and if there's some value to tying something to the addition or not. Comments or thoughts?
I would love to have it. I'm also scared of it because the one breaking change that I wasn't expecting for my try-RFC was something using Nevertype.
Okay, what was that?
It was something that depended on the coercion of Nevertype to anything, because something ended up with, I think something was using bang as a error, and the arm just sort of magically worked with a value of bang type.
Okay, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. I think I put a note in Zulip about it like a month or two ago.
Okay, I sort of remember that. Const generics. So const generics, we've been having weekly meetings, looking at the implementation, and so, I should add, min const generics is stable or almost stable. It hit beta, right?
Yeah, it'll be stable 25th.
It's pretty awesome. And we've been having weekly meetings and looking at what we can do and some of the implementation challenges going forward. And one of the things that came up this week was basically various small extensions we can do to go past min const generic slightly. And I made a little list here of the things that LCNR was citing. So one of them is, right now there's a limitation that says has to be lifetimes types constants. We could lift that so that you can have lifetimes and then types and constants intermixed. I'm actually in favor of generally removing all these limitations, when we get around to it. It's some high priority to me. There was an internal thread that I meant to link here, but forgot to, arguing against it. I don't know, I'm wondering if anyone has strong opinions about it. The argument against, I think, was
for it as well.
Yeah, there's different opinions. I think the argument against was sort of that they asserted that it was more, here's the thread, that it was more ergonomic to keep the restriction. I personally consider, I don't feel that way. It says you can keep the rules of types but come before constants and the user friendliness that comes with it. But I don't find that user friendly as a user, but other people's mileage may vary, I guess.
Yeah, I will say my personal sort of general feeling is that we should also try to, as we add more sort of const generics and so forth, look at seeing if we can make the type parameters, like, so that you don't have to, like, if you add a type parameter but it's default or could be inferred, that you don't actually have to list the underscore, which is super annoying.
You're talking about in the call?
Calls, yeah. Like currently, if you list anything, you have to list everything, and it's
an it seems like an orthogonal thing, but I agree that it's annoying.
well, it's potentially related in the sense that if you remove the ordering restriction, I guess it's a question of, do you remove only the restriction at the sort of declaration site, but you still keep the order in the sense that you have to match the declaration in the call, or if you want to do some sort of like named, like if you use the same name, then you get,
Well, when you do the call, you don't give names usually.
Right. What I'm saying is that if we remove the ordering restriction, we could like there's a sort of further step of saying, you remove the ordering restriction and you allow sort of named
parameters.
call site. And potentially, if you allow the call site to have different names, then you don't actually care about the ordering restriction at the definition site as much.
I would be in favor of some syntax that allows you to give names at the call site personally, but I would probably want it to work together and be aligned with a similar thing for non-generic parameters. I don't know. Anyway, it seems like an orthogonal thing, but yes, I agree, it'd be worth considering. I'm particularly worried about long lists of type parameters that are independent, like box has a defaulted allocator and a defaulted whatever else and a defaulted something else, and I just want to specify one of them, not all of them. Or I guess like hash map has a hasher and an allocator.
Yeah.
Okay. I think what we'll do for these things probably is make basically stabilization reports as they get. I don't think RFC is a necessary step, but I'd be curious if people disagree. Maybe this one, the first one, is the only case where I think RFC might make sense. The other one is allow defaults on const parameters. That seems kind of like just a no-brainer. This one is a little more interesting. Permitting underscore as a const generic argument. The reason that's interesting is that currently we require that the caller knows whether the argument is a type or a constant. And supporting underscore would step away from that rule because underscore could either be a type or a constant to be inferred, and you have to look at the callee to figure it out. And once you go that far, you can do other things. For example, values like unit and ZST. It's not that useful in practice, but today if you had like const t unit as a function, you kind of can't call it because when you write foo : unit, it gets treated as a type, and so you get an error. That makes sense.
So you just have to put braces around it?
Yeah, that's right. You can call it, but you have to put braces. But we want to lift that restriction, and the same applies to like certain kinds of paths, like the ZST path here.
Yeah. Sorry, someone's typing quite loud.
Oh, yeah, it's probably Josh. I don't know for sure. I just know I often mute Josh when that happens, and it works.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, so is there any concern about going forward with these with stabilization reports, or do we think we need RFCs?
I remember type parameter defaults being somewhat more complicated than I expected them to be, which makes me think that the rules getting written down in an RFC somewhere might be valuable. I'm thinking of like the default on hash set and where it applies and where it doesn't apply. It was not super obvious to people. Some of the other ones, like if the ordering restriction happens to go away, if that doesn't change anything other than the ordering, then hopefully there's not any interesting conversation to have. But
the main thing that's interesting about it is that removing the restriction, or if you keep the restriction, like there's interactions between this third one and the first one, because, for example, the proposal on internals rests on being able to tell at the call site whether something is a constant or a type.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's RFC. It's just true.
The set of things that can be assumed to be const expressions at like parse time without the braces also feels like one of those. What's the rules for that? I know the current ones. Maybe it would be worth a conversation for if those are expanding to something to find a philosophy for it, kind of a thing that would make sense in an RFC. Because I think right now it's just, well, we have this one super easy case and everything else takes braces.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I don't know how to decide on the other ones.
I'm thinking we want like a vision doc here too. This is such a clear case of like, we have a thing we want to get to and we're like in a weird place in the middle and we want to be able to talk about, here's where we're going, here's the actual step we're taking and why it takes us closer to where we're going. We
had that const skill tree at some point, right? That was sort of similar.
Yeah, that's kind of in the same direction. Yeah. All right, it's sounding like we're thinking, let's do either RFC or like a really good stabilization report. It's somewhere in between, like it needs an argument for it to lay out the rules for sure, right? Okay.
That was my thought, yeah. Just from experience of the rules for type defaults are complicated enough that I'm worried that that'll happen for const defaults too.
Yeah, okay. Next thing on the list, I guess we put this in the doc, declarative macro repetition counts. I know they opened an RFC. Is there anything else people want to say about it?
This seems to sort of be bringing in the thing we talked about around introducing a new syntactic form for special things. And the last time we talked about that, we decided not to do that. I don't know how strong and not to do that was. I don't actually have a problem with this, and this seems perfectly reasonable. I was just pondering, like, does this mean we should have dollar brace self close brace for the same thing that we talked about doing dollar self last time?
Right. I don't recall us specifically saying we don't want to introduce a new syntax. I recall us saying we don't want to introduce special case syntaxes of let's dedicate dollar some symbol that isn't currently assigned to some specific function. And I think we were primarily concerned about there are a limited number of extensions we can make. This seems like it's doing what we actually wanted, which was to introduce a generalizable syntax that is arbitrarily extensible in the future to cover anything we might need. I actually think this makes perfect sense.
I don't recall this discussion personally.
We talked about dollar self or something like that once upon a time when we found out that dollar self can't be self like a path. And then we had a conversation about how much of this should be macros 2.0 versus macros 1. I guess the big difference for this proposal is that it has nothing to do with hygiene. So
exactly,
most of the things that we were worried about there don't apply to this one, and this does seem pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, and it seems like they would probably apply equally to a macros 2.0, assuming it keeps the dollar sign.
Right. And if for some reason macros 2.0 used a different syntax in place of dollar sign, then we could define what is the syntax for getting into the call a macro related thing, and then use the same set of syntax with a different opener. But I would hope that we just use the dollar syntax for macros 2.0 for familiarity.
All right.
But it's definitely different from $self for a variety of reasons, not least of which $self broke the universe, and we didn't want to have that kind of transition pain. And this isn't hygiene related at all and doesn't break things.
Yeah. All right, let's move this to the RFC and keep going. I'm worried we're spending too much time on each item. So, if there's further concern, instruction set update. So I posted this big comment from Locathor. I haven't actually fully read it, I have to admit. What are they saying?
I did read through this when they posted it on Zulip.
Can you summarize the key? Is there key takeaways?
Key takeaway is this is hard in implementation in the compiler, that trying to mix instruction set, it is difficult to deal with that together with inline functions, and a lot of Rust's performance wins and zero cost abstractions are obtained by having inlineable functions. So part of the concern is, yes, we could have an instruction set, but if it then blocks you from inlining things in a different instruction set, then we may have such terrible performance that it becomes a almost a correctness problem of, I didn't expect that to be obscenely expensive.
Why would we ever expect a lot of things to have instruction set attributes? Wouldn't that be expected to be fairly unusual?
It depends on the target that you're on. If you're on a target where you want to be able to have both ARM and thumb, then it is apparently not uncommon on embedded platforms to use instruction set frequently.
Okay.
What I wonder, and what this I think doesn't cover, is there some fundamental reason that instruction set and inlining couldn't be made to work reliably in combination, in that if you were able to inline from one to the other, you would just need to swap instruction set and say, well, if I'm inlining in a thumb function, I need to generate thumb code. If that's a thing that we could do, that might solve part of this problem. But I don't know why that's not acceptable.
Like a non-Lang team question to me, but
yeah,
maybe.
I agree. I think the degree to which this is a Lang team question is perhaps, is this the right abstraction? And if we have this, is this going to break, is this going to break badly enough that we don't end up wanting it? So it's a language decision if quality of implementation isn't possible.
okay. Well, it sounds like no one's pressing for this to stabilize in the short term. I don't know if there's active work exploring these alternatives and so on. It also sounds like this would be forwards compatible. Like, you could stabilize what's there. It may not behave how you expect, and we could tinker and improve on the implementation, and it would be okay. Like if it were getting more.
As long as the correctness was not an issue with inline always. Right now, it sounds like if we stabilize the current behavior, it would actually be broken entirely. But if we should double check that with Locathor and figure out if the current behavior is safe.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, some of this language is very informal, so it's hard for me to tell what kind of hose means, for example. But I would have assumed it meant you may not get the instructions that you asked for, or you may not get inlining. You kind of can't have both today. Inline always is always a hint, even despite its name, right? Like if it's recursive, for example, it won't inline.
Yeah.
So if you're relying on that, you should, like, if you want to rely on that, you have to take into account all of LLVM's rules anyway, which would include these. But okay. All right. Any final comments or try trade?
I want to grab some time if I can steal 5 minutes, but if we want to look at meeting proposals and stuff like that first, that would be fine too.
I don't know that we have any meeting proposals. Or do
Okay.
we? Let me take a look. I had some thoughts on I wanted to use for that, but I think we have a little time to talk about try.
So the kind of straw poll I was hoping to get is how people would feel about doing an addition change here for some of the weirder interconversion scenarios. If you take a look at the Rust Analyzer pull request I did, this was an example of a breakage where Rust Analyzer was actually using both directions of the result to option and option to result conversion. Because it was inside enough closures that it all just inferred the things. It didn't actually want it, but it was doing it, which is another. So it's just an example, still waiting on Crater for the full set of thoughts, but this makes a good example of, oh, okay, there's even more ways that people could be doing this. I think we have said that we don't want people doing this, although it goes to somewhat of a lib decision as well. I have a basic plan for how this could be made an addition change so that 2015 and 2018, this would still compile. 2021, this would not compile without being a major burden in the compiler or the library. I was looking for sort of a straw poll on how people thought about, like, is this code enough of a problem that it's worth breaking? Would it be fine to warn against it? Should we just keep it working and not worry about it, etc.?
My opinion is I'm open to a change. The goal would be to prevent result option interconversion, among other things.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would personally be in favor of removing those in an addition if we expect that doing so will not be a substantial transition burden for the vast majority of code bases. I am a fan of the general approach of having that special module within the new try proposal to contain those conversions and just not having that module be present in the new prelude.
Yeah, I don't really care about the implementation, but it seems reasonable to stop doing these conversions. I think they were sort of a mistake.
I'm curious, Scott, in your opinion here, like the motivation. I don't have a preference too much in either direction, but I'm curious whether like the big motivation here is just like this is inefficient to have these conversions, and you're better off writing the code to say directly what the thing you're making is, so you don't have the cost of the conversions, or if it's you might have a bug, you don't realize it, and that somehow that bug is being masked by this, although it's hard for me to imagine where that would arise, or is it just the code should say what the code does, and that's all it's about?
I don't think there's any efficiency concern here. It's more of a, it loses, this was not supposed to work, so it was the previous RFC did not intentionally do this, and I think that what I've generally heard from people is that it would be better to call OK or and pass a error message that says something meaningful if you're going to be returning a result.
Yeah, so the non-error type that's using this is still unstable. It's just that you can accidentally use it while not naming it, like Rust Analyzer was doing. So this was never supposed to happen. So if we can just break it, and if Rust Analyzer is maybe one of the very few that's actually using it, then I would be all for it. We should look at the Crater run to see how much of the world is breaking.
Yeah. The Crater run should start in about 2 days. in maybe 1 or 2 days to find out how bad this is overall. I think the Rust Analyzer PR is a good example that it actually wanted to be using option the whole time anyway, and it just didn't find out about it.
Right. The code is definitely clearer that way. I'd like to go towards, even though I said we could take some time, we took our 5 minutes. I'd like to cut to meeting
great.
proposals. I don't, if there are any other project updates, well, you should have put them in the people can leave them on or something. I do see we have some more active projects, but I don't think any of them have major updates that I know of. So I was wrong. There are some meeting proposals, and I wanted to add Backlog Bonanza as something that we could have sort of let go and might consider using some slots for. So I'll open the floor, I guess. Let's just put in actually, before we talk about what to schedule, let's just talk about what the weeks are and if anyone's not available on any particular week. We have March 10th, March 17th, March 24th, and March 31st.
I'm not available next week.
Okay.
And not exactly in a meeting proposal specifically, but it sounds like the edition deadline's going to be the end of March, maybe. I don't know if there'll be anything that we need a meeting for before then.
So specifically what that deadline is if there's any, it should have an approved RFC or other formal decision. Just for context for everyone else. I don't know of anything that we need a meeting on specifically for that, but it may come up. It's a good idea to leave a slot for it, kind of. I think Felix, do you want to talk about how to disable an atomic bomb?
Yeah. Am I muted right now? No.
No.
So basically the heart of this is, I don't know how much backstory to get into here. The heart of it is that, like, it's not clear to me how we intend people to write certain kinds of code, like intrusive linked lists and whatnot, because we have this long-standing issue where if you try to deallocate something via based on the value of an atomic reference count, technically we haven't specified like whether it's legal to actually still hold on to that reference. If you have a reference to something and the reference namely to the atomic reference count that's stored within the cell that you're going to be deallocating, the memory cell you're going to be deallocating, then the act of then using that dereference count to sort of trigger the deallocation means you still end up having your hands on a shared reference to that atomic reference count, and that is currently not allowed in terms of like the semantics of the language. And my original approach to trying to resolve this was to say let's duplicate the API surface for the atomic API to let you pass in raw pointers everywhere. And that got some pushback because it's a pretty big API surface. It's like the most obvious thing to do in terms of like something that seems trivial to me in terms of, you just do it and you live with it, but it is a large API surface to support. And it also then leads to people saying, well, wait, which thing am I supposed to use at which times? And the insight that came up is that someone pointed out that basically we could just say, look, like if something's allowed to be mutated under the hood because it's behind an unsafe cell or because it's behind, basically if it's behind the same things as unsafe cell, then you're also allowed to deallocate it. The compilers can't assume that it's going to stay allocated. And thus, in particular, an ampersand atomic int would be able to be deallocated under that rule change. So this is like a relatively simple change to the language semantics in terms of what the compiler is and isn't allowed to assume that would solve this problem. It's just a question of doing it and having this sort of, buy-in from everyone to say, yes, that makes sense to do that.
So is this something we should have a meeting for, or should someone write an RFC or something?
I don't know what it deserves. Like I get the feeling that like we already have our resident expert or non-resident expert. Ralph has already sort of said this seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah. I feel like
So-
this has come up in some other contexts. I'm trying to page it in. I can't remember. I'll think of it later. But I guess I wouldn't be opposed to meeting about it. I'm just not sure it's.
I can believe it's not worth all of our time. I
I
just
would
want to
like
make sure it
the
was
purpose
raised.
of the meeting clearly identified. But if it's to educate us and just have a chance to talk this through and bring the lane team up to speed, that seems like a valuable goal.
For me, I want a strategy for resolving this problem because there are customers that are trying to write code that does this, and they're sitting there saying, they're getting feedback, or they aren't clear on what's legal, and there's some incoherency in our own internal discussions about whether it's legal or not. So yeah.
Well, at least, should we schedule it for the 24th or something? Or the 17th?
It's worth noting that people have written this code, and not that that's to say that we can't break written code or declare that something that was previously poorly specified is now UB. But it would be nice to make a semantics here that doesn't actually miscompile all the things in the wild.
Yep.
Because this is a fairly common thing to do.
I agree, that's a good constraint. I guess let me rephrase this. I would like to do this more Amazon Docs style, by which I mean, I would like there to be a write-up beforehand that's like, here's the proposal, here's the sort of frequently asked questions or whatever else to give details about it. I don't know if that exists, but I feel like the closest thing that exists right now is Ralph points you at a Julep comment on the issue and says this is the most recent idea. Is that correct?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So I'm willing to schedule it, but only if you're willing to take the time to write that doc. Or someone else is.
I am happy to sort of help out in writing that document, but I don't know to the extent that I can commit to doing it entirely.
Yeah, I really want this done.
Ralph might be willing to.
I'll commit to making sure doc is produced.
On that note, should we give it March 31st or something to give maximum time?
I don't know. Part of my problem is there's other things going on that I'm like, am I just gonna end up with multiple things all lined up?
Yeah, I would not do the 24th actually. Well, I guess maybe it doesn't matter, but I was just thinking that the 24th is also that week is the release week. So,
fine.
Well, I know that Felix sometimes gets pulled away.
It's a good reason. Let's do the 31st.
Okay.
All right. Discuss the amount of oversight Lang should have for lints. What do we do? I think this bear trait, I don't think we need a meeting for this. We've been over this. We have a proposal that, I don't know what came out of that meeting yesterday, Mark, with Ryan and everything, but I think we're pretty close to a proposal, right?
That's my impression, yeah. Or at least I don't think we need a meeting.
I think, yes, I agree with the statement that this needs a proposal. I think we shouldn't schedule it in that case. Sort of feel the same about macros. It's a little bit it's a little vague for a topic to me.
I'm not sure if this is baked enough for a design meeting. I wanted to bring it up simply because we've had several things come up in the context of macros recently, and it feels like we're nibbling around the edges. I don't necessarily think we should have a macros 2.0 meeting unless somebody's ready to say, I want to implement macros 2.0. But I think there'd be value in saying, should we have a general extension point? What things should we add to that extension point? Is the proposal for the other RFC that we saw earlier in this meeting the right direction, or do we want to do a different direction check? It feels like we ought to be able to provide more general guidance on macros that isn't driven purely by what have we been asked right this second.
That would be nice, but I think it wants a group around it to or like a person who's going to own it and do that preparation.
No argument there. I'm mostly asking, are we open to having such a meeting if somebody's prepared to drive it concretely?
I guess it feels, I don't know, to me personally, that the meeting as it's described right now is insufficiently concrete to agree to it. But if there was a more concrete proposal, then I would be more inclined to, evaluate it on its own merits in some sense.
That sounds right to me.
It's fair.
So the other two things, I wanted to do a meeting to go back over the backlog bonanza that we did last time with the RFCs and like double check what happened and do it if there's ambiguity. And I've been working on this proposal for a while to change, and by working on, I mean talking about mostly. So I have a sketch somewhere of a like, this was based on our sort of discussion about roles in the Lang team that we had a little while ago. And I would be happy to schedule time to work on this proposal with people or talk about it. Not if it was a work meeting, maybe not everyone would have to attend, but just if you're interested, let me find my link. But it's basically around adding this like revised Shepherd's thing that we were talking about, and maybe talking a little bit about how triage should work. So I'd be willing to commit to producing a document for the meeting if we wanted to do that. I kind of already have it, so. I would propose that we do backlog bonanza on the 17th and org work meeting on the 24th. You want to object to that? I'll create the issues for these. I broke my own rule. I don't care. It's the privileges. All right, I'm going to take the lack of comments as total enthusiasm.
Yeah, one thing I might call out as a process note is that for the future, we might want to consider sort of just always not having a meeting on the subsequent week if we don't have a doc yet, if that makes sense. So just schedule, like have a 1 week gap or whatever.
Effectively, when we're having our planning meeting, in order to have a meeting the next week, it must be, let's schedule something for which there has already been a proposal and doc.
Right, or potentially an alternative might be that instead of stopping at March 31st, which is the week before the next planning meeting, we actually schedule something for the sort of 2 weeks. I don't know if that makes sense, but like we skip the week for the planning meeting, but then we actually schedule something for the next week now. And if it's not scheduled now, it doesn't get scheduled. I don't know. Maybe this is too advanced.
The heart of this is the idea that like basically a week, having only a week to prepare a doc isn't reasonable, and so you're better off having the things overlap where you have the planning meeting for the next cycle actually start before the cycle is done, right?
Right. Essentially, yeah. And not only if it's not enough time to prepare the doc, but it's not enough time for people to read the doc and so forth.
Well, yeah, the Amazon way to do that is to say that you don't have to read the doc until the meeting itself, but that's yeah.
Which I actually quite like.
I'm a big fan.
I don't know. It's an interesting thought. I like the Amazon way of saying you don't read the doc till the meeting, because I think it's realistic. The idea being basically everyone's busy and that's the time that's allocated.
But importantly, the docs are written with that in mind. They're written to be read at the beginning of a meeting, which is really crucial.
But I do think I saw no Pink Felix, and like I didn't intentionally not schedule March 10th, but I just forgot that didn't mean nothing, that we had it was available. But I'm okay scheduling nothing there. I think we should do the simpler version of your rule, Mark, which is we will tend not to schedule things there unless there's like high confidence that the work will get done, which is really means if it's already done. I'd rather not have the more complex version of having to think about like overlapping rescheduling for.
Yeah, seems
I can
reasonable.
easily imagine scenarios where a doc or whatever hasn't been written in time for a given meeting, and thus it gets potentially pushed over, and thus the work actually may have been done in future cycles.
Yeah, for example, stuff like that. And that's another thing we could say is try to set a rule for like, well, if we're not expected to read the doc until the meeting, I would still like to have a rule that says the doc has to be written like by the triage meeting, because I want people to know if they have that time free with at least a
I like
day's
that rule.
notice. Let's say that. And then if you want to read it ahead of time, you can. Written and sent out. No expectation people will read until the meeting. All right, thanks everyone. See you later.
Okay.
Bye.